capitalism as we know it is a flawed implementation of free market principles.
If you go back far enough in time, human history is an absolute bloodbath of people stealing land and stuff from one another time and time again. At some point, we have to just say a group had rightful ownership to this property and roll it forward.
In 1830, if you are a healthy, capable human being, you have the ability to go beyond the margin of cultivation to work free available land. That does not describe the world that you and I live in.
If you don't honor the territoriality of the species, you create social disharmony, right? You take the 3-year-old's toy away, then they're naturally angry, right? Why are they angry? Because they're a territorial species.
This was a town with 4,000 people. The mayor of this town introduced a complementary currency that depreciated 1% per month. And people had to purchase stamps for 1% of the face value of the bill and stick them on the bill. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts.
So if I break into your house and steal your TV and I go put it on auction, that doesn't mean I'm participating in a free market process. That means I stole your TV and you still own it.
We need to get to the fundamentals of money, which of course is your wheelhouse.
We're going to be talking a lot today about the thinking of this economist, Silvio Gesell. And he has this idea of the natural economic order that rethinks both capitalism and socialism. And to do that, like any good, deep, nuanced discussion, we're going to have to start with defining some terms. So I don't know if you want to start with his life story and a little bit of background on him before we go into the definitions. Would that make the most sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So Silvio Gesell was a German. He was born in 1862. He was from a relatively poor family and didn't have the financial resources to go to university, and he instead went to work as a young man, working for his older brothers. He first went to Spain, and then he ended up in Argentina, where he was a representative of his brother's company selling dental supplies. And this was right around the very end of the 19th century. And he was in Argentina at a time when the Argentinian economy went through a period of extreme economic instability, and he was trying to run a business through all of that. There was runaway inflation, there was deflation, and through the experiences of trying to manage a business, through all of that upheaval, he developed a perspective on money, on free markets that, in my opinion, was wholly original and represents, in my view, the purest understanding of the concepts of free markets that I'm aware of. I would say key to understanding his perspective is to disentangle the terms capitalism and free markets. Mm-hmm. Most people would take those words to be synonyms. Gesell would say that they are not the same things, that capitalism as we know it is a flawed implementation of free market principles. And specifically, there are two fundamental flaws in the implementation of the free market system, which are our systems of land and money. And that the common thread between those two problems is that they both give rise to what he referred to as unearned income. What that means is that people who hold and control land and money receive wealth that they have not contributed to the creation of. And in the case of land, that takes the form of rent on land. In the case of money, that takes the form of interest on money. And the way that I put it, this is my most concise paraphrasing of my understanding of Gesell, is that if someone is receiving wealth without creating it, then someone else is creating wealth without receiving it. And so I would say that, in a sense, Gesell and Marx came from the same time and place and set of concerns. They both asked, why does the capitalist system, which produces historically unprecedented amounts of wealth, also perpetually create poverty, increasing wealth inequality, recurring economic crises. And although Gesell did not include this, I think it's an important thing to include 100 years later, which is unsustainable environmental practices, unsustainable use of natural resources, which has become, I think, a much more pressing concern in the 100 years since Gesell.
Okay, so the delta then between free markets and capitalism, you're saying, are these concepts of, is it free money and free land?
Those are his solutions to the problems.
Those are his solutions. So what are the problems called then?
The problems are
it's land ownership.
Land ownership is in his view a violation of the principles of free markets, and I would be happy to discuss why.
So does he subscribe to private property?
Yes, but not in land. Exactly.
Okay, so let's go there. How do you handle the allocation, distribution, caretaking of land absent private property?
National ownership of land with competitive...
State ownership.
Yes, with competitive bidding for leases.
And so is that identical to Marxism?
No.
Well, Marx said you could summarize communism specifically in one sentence: the abolition of private property. This sounds like maybe more of like a socialistic, watered down version of that, where you're just abolishing private property in land, but maintaining private property and everything else. Is that correct?
That's correct, but I would not call it socialist at all. I would say from a certain perspective, from my perspective, it's actually a strengthening of the principle of private property, because I believe that improperly including land in the category of forms of legitimate private property, you are greatly weakening the foundations upon which the institution of private property is based. And I would say that we need to examine those foundations.
And why is that? Why does private property and land undermine private property more broadly?
What would you say is the theoretical foundation for the institution of private property? Why does private property exist? Why should private property exist?
What is the theoretical foundation for it? My general view is that, as most social organisms are, human beings are territorial. And if you don't honor the territoriality of the species, that you create social disharmony. I always like to give the example of the 3-year-old, right? You take the 3-year-old's toy away, they get mad at you. That's because that 3-year-old has the exclusive right in their mind, in that moment in time, the exclusive right to control, use, and play with that asset, in this case, a toy. And if you arbitrarily come up and remove it from them, then they're naturally angry, right? Why are they angry? Because they're a territorial species and they appreciate control over the means at their disposal. So without the ability, and now you could go into someone like Ayn Rand, who would say that private property rights are the basis of all human rights, because private property rights are your right to control the means of your own survival. And if you don't have the right to control the means of your own survival, then you don't have the right to your own life. And for Ayn Rand, the right to life was the most fundamental right, and private property rights were their only workable implementation. So that's where I would leave the theoretical foundations, but there's also just this idea of justice, which is really just a very, you could just say people keeping what they earned and people not keeping what they did not earn, right? If you worked to create it, or you traded with someone via consent that worked to create it, or otherwise created it through a chain of consensual exchange, well, then you have the rights to fully enjoy that asset. You also, we always call it private property rights, but they're always simultaneously private property responsibilities. Because if you don't maintain that asset, well, then there's going to be nothing to enjoy, right? If you own the car, but you don't change the oil, well, then eventually you're not going to have a car. You're going to have a hunk of metal and fiberglass that doesn't move sitting in your driveway. So there's this idea of justice, I think, built into the theoretical foundations of private property that, as far as I can tell, are the only workable implementation for social harmony.
Okay. There are two things that I would like to respond to in what you just said. I want to take the first one first. The second one was what I was hoping you were going to say, that essentially if you made it, you own it. And that's what I'm going to come to second. The first one is that in order to survive, you need access to land and natural resources. And that is 100% true. Gesell would completely agree with that. He would say that allowing private ownership of land is completely contrary to that. By allowing land to be owned by private individuals, you are denying access to everyone else to...
How? That doesn't make any sense.
Because there's a limited amount of it.
No. If an individual can own land, then any individual can own land. Who are you denying access to?
Eventually, all the land is owned and new people get born, and those people in a system of private land ownership are at the mercy of the people who have monopolized ownership of the land. That would be his answer.
No, I think that's a category error, because then you're saying those people, you're automatically circumscribing this class of landowners and non-landowners, and you look at these as two static aggregates, and that's not the case. Each of those aggregates is decomposable into individuals. So if there's land owners, well, they can sell land to non-land owners, and then that you can have migration from the group of non-landowners to the group of landowners. And people that own themselves and own their own labor always have the ability in a world with private property to go out and sell their labor into the marketplace, accrue savings or money, and then exchange that for any asset, including land. So there is no exclusionary principle whatsoever in the private ownership of land, so far as I can tell.
I don't agree with that statement because think about the vastly different circumstances that existed in the early 19th century as opposed to the circumstances that exist today as it pertains to the availability of land.
But what does that have to do with the private property interest in land?
Because in 1830, if you are a healthy, capable human being who is living at the margin of cultivation and you don't like the deal being offered by prospective employers, you have the ability to go beyond the margin of cultivation to work unworked, free, available land and to derive your livelihood from that.
Homesteading, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is great while it lasts, but that does not describe the world that you and I live in.
Is there no homesteading available in the world today?
Not on any significant scale. I mean, I have heard of like defunct towns in Italy where you can go and buy a house for $1. But that's where I would say that's where capitalism has failed and collapsed. So that land has been appropriated and so mismanaged that it has become available again. But that's quite different from land that is appropriated initially.
See, that exact example is why I would say capitalism is working. If an asset has been owned by a private property, an individual via private property, and they've mismanaged it to the point to where its selling point has collapsed to $1, well, that's exactly what you want to happen, right? They have mismanaged the asset, therefore it is now selling on the market at a very cheap price. And now, presumably, a person that would have better caretaking ability, that could be a better steward of that asset, would then come in and buy it and start to invest in it and enjoy the capital appreciation and possibly rent it out or do whatever income generating activity they can on it. So why I'm struggling? Why you say that's why capitalism has failed? I would say that's where capitalism's perfectly working.
I did not mean to focus on what I would consider to be a tiny anomalous situation, which is, some little Italian town where you can go and buy a house for $1. That does not describe the world at large. The world at large is one in which all of the land is owned and costs a lot of money to get access to. So if you take that same healthy, strong, capable individual who needs to provide for his or her own physical sustenance and does not like the options being offered by the existing economic system, that person no longer has the option to walk beyond the margin of cultivation and to start earning his or her own sustenance from nature.
And so the solution then in this view is that because all of the land, and I'm not going to agree to this, but let's just say for argument's sake that all the land is owned privately and there are no homesteading opportunities at all in the world. I don't think that's the case, but just for argument's sake, we'll say that is the situation. That the solution then, because all the land is owned, that we should now collapse the institution of private property and land and redistribute it via what mechanism?
Gesell proposed that the government should buy out all existing landowners and at current market prices, and then allocate land use via competitive bidding for leases. And the revenue from those leases would represent the primary source of public treasury.
And who would provide the funds for buying those lands? If the government's going to buy all those lands, taxpayers are going to pay for it. So which taxpayers are going to pay for it?
You're not going to like my answer, but the answer is that the government creates the currency to...
Oh, so all the savers pay for it via debasement of their savings.
In that transition, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so after we've stolen enough purchasing power from all the savers via currency debasement to buy up all the land and reallocate it according to bureaucratic whim of the state, then what happens?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that characterization. I would not say it's via the bureaucratic whim of the state. It is the free market for leases. If you see a piece of land and you have a prospective use for it.
Yeah, this is where I would say you can't say that's free market though, because it was funded by proceeds stolen from savers via currency debasement. So it's already not a free market transaction. It's if I break into your house and steal your TV and I go put it on auction, that doesn't mean I'm participating in a free market process. That means I stole your TV and you still own it.
All right.
I don't have the right to sell it.
We definitely need to get to the fundamentals of money, which of course is your wheelhouse. But before we get to that, I want to finish our examination of the institution of private ownership of land, because like I said, there was the second point, which was the one that I was mainly waiting for,
right?
Which was for you to say that the the basis for private property in general is human labor.
You keep it, yeah.
You made it, you keep it. That most economists agree with that principle. I agree with that principle. Silvio Gesell agreed with that principle, but no one made land. And therefore, land cannot become private property on the basis of if you made it, you own it.
I would somewhat agree. No one made land. I would agree with that particular statement, but humans do make land saleable, usable, leasable, all these things, all the modifications that are done to the land, all the improvements, whether it's structures, irrigation, crops, whatever activity is going on the land, there is, even if you just sell raw land, it takes humans to sell things. So there's always some value add of the human being to the asset in the marketplace. That's like an unavoidable reality, even if it's just being marketed. Right? You just purchased raw land and now you're marketing raw land for sale. Well, that takes human beings to do that process, even if you made no improvements to the land.
Agreed. There is a clear distinction that must be made between raw land and improvements to land. Improvements to land can and should be privately owned. Raw land, according to the Gesellian perspective, according to my perspective,
government owned and leased.
See,
so it's government ownership of all land, you're saying worldwide.
Yeah, but I prefer we replace the word government with community.
I mean, that's a beautiful Marxist trope we've heard a million times, but it's never worked in practice.
Okay, well, we will, if time allows, get to my individual vision of what to do with these principles. But there's a lot of ground to cover before we get to that. I am not a proponent of implementing these ideas via government, but I am now talking for myself and not for Silvio Gesell. And that's an important distinction for me to make clear.
Where do we go next to the money issue? I guess just to finish that thought, though, that Aristotle said, when everybody owns everything, nobody owns anything. No, when everybody owns everything, nobody takes care of anything, I think is what he said, because there's no incentive. If the community just owns everything, well, then you have the tragedy of the commons. It's like, well, we all own it. Why would I go and take care of the park? There's also an issue that Rothbard brought up, that it's impossible to build an information system around everyone owning everything. Right, that you'd have to go out and actually get people's, acquiescence to any deal. So if all 330 million Americans owned every plot of land, every time we tried to sell or lease a plot of land, you would, in theory, need to get approval via some democratic mechanism from all 330 million Americans. I assume this would be on a country by country basis and not one world government. But I guess that maybe is an assumption I should ask about too.
Yeah, Gesell was opposed to national boundaries. He believed.
Oh, so this is one world government owning all the land and leasing it back to the people.
That's his version.
Okay.
Yeah. But I want to take one step back.
Extremely scary, but go where you like.
I want to take one step back before we go forward.
Okay.
I want to reiterate what I just said before, which is, and I want to see if you give your approval to this fundamental statement, which is that if we agree that the correct and legitimate basis of owning private property of any form is human effort, if you made it, you owned it, you own it, then there is no legitimate way for raw land to become private property on that basis.
I think the libertarian argument is if you homesteaded a previously unused resource. So if it was raw land out in the jungle that no one's using, and you go and you build the fence and you cut down the trees and you plant the farm, well, you have now appropriated that from nature and you now own it. So it's like original homesteading. So yes, I do believe you can have private property interest in land. That's what I was trying to say earlier, that no matter what the asset is, there is some level of human involvement and therefore some level of human additiveness to the land that can make it yours, even if it is original homesteading. So I don't agree. I agree with the statement, no one made the land, right? God, nature, whatever you want to say, made the land. But man participates in making that land a usable, fruitful asset. And therefore, man can have private property interest in land. That is my rough understanding of the libertarian viewpoint.
Okay. Well, I would reiterate the distinction between the raw land and the improvements to the land, and I would agree 100% with what you just said as it pertains to the improvements. But I would say that there is no legitimate basis for that principle to be extended to the raw land, because the raw land is not the product of human labor. And private property, in order for private property to exist on rational foundations, it must be the product of human labor.
I don't know. I don't agree there either, because, well, the farmer plants a bunch of crops. That's some aspect of human labor. He tilled the soil, he planted the crops, etc. But then what does he do? He lets rain and sunshine, the commons, cause it to grow and create economic yield in the form of berries or crops or whatever the thing is. Does that mean he should not have private property interest in the berries or the crops because of the sunshine and the rain?
No, he's collaborating with nature.
Yeah, I think you're collaborating with nature when you homestead land.
But he doesn't own the sunlight. He doesn't own the sun. He doesn't own the air. You don't need to own the sun. And therefore, he shouldn't own the land either. The land is equivalent to the sunlight. It is something that existed before the existence of man. It is something that is not created by man. It is something, therefore, that is not susceptible to...
The difference between land and sunlight is scarcity. So there is a finite supply of land. There's more demand than there is supply for land. So therefore, it's scarce, and it needs to be allocated either via conflict, which we do oftentimes in the world. We have wars over land. We currently have land theft occurring in the Middle East, like it's an ongoing human affair, or it needs to be doled out via contract, as we described earlier. So that you have to resolve the tension between there's more demand for the asset than there is quantity of the asset. This is basically where pricing comes from. Sunlight, oxygen, these other things, they're actually super abundant, that there is more supply of these things than there is demand. Therefore,
that's temporary.
Therefore, there is no market price for sunlight. There's no market price for oxygen. We don't go to wars over sunlight and oxygen.
Remember the movie Total Recall? The Arnold Schwarzenegger movie?
I saw it. I know the movie, but I haven't seen it in 20 years probably.
That's where they've colonized Mars, and people are living in these enclosed cities, and the control of the flow of air becomes control over life and death.
Right.
And I would say that the superabundance of air is a temporary state of affairs, in just the same way that the superabundance of land once characterized the human condition and no longer does. There is not an infinite supply of air or water or land. They are all limited because we live on a planet of finite size and mass.
So for practical purposes, you think there's a point in the future in human history to be that we are going to have so much demand for oxygen, let's say, that it exceeds the supply of oxygen, and there will be a market price for oxygen?
It certainly could be the case. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that's even remotely possible. I mean, we'd have to do some math on the quantity of, how much oxygen people consume versus how much oxygen trees produce and how much there is already in the atmosphere. I guess it's possible in some sci-fi future, but I don't see that happening on Earth
It's
whatsoever.
Certainly mathematically possible. You may be right that it's not practically possible, but...
Yeah, it's the same argument about resources in the ground. They say that we're going to run out of oil or coal or whatever this thing may be, but the reality is the production of commodities has increased every year for decades on end. So as demand goes up, price goes up, and as price goes up, we find more economically viable ways of producing the thing. And if it gets to a point that, hey, producing the thing is it is actually scarce and the price is too high, we tend to innovate and find alternatives.
Yeah, but you're talking about, in a geological context, you're talking about a minuscule sliver of time. You're talking about 100, 200 years in the context of geological ages, which are billions of years. So I would say that the condition of, or rather the transition from superabundance of land to scarcity of land, and the analogous hypothetical of a transition from superabundance of air to scarcity of air in geological terms is by no means off the chart.
Yeah, it's possible in the grandest scope of geologic time, sure, but let's try to focus on the economics.
Yes.
In the more immediate term. Even immediate term in geologic time is still the vast long run in economic terms, right? 1,000 years is a geologic, not even the blink of an eye, but 1,000 years is the extreme long run in economics terms.
Yes.
In Bitcoin, we often dream about the idea of forming citadels, which are independent, self-sovereign communities that have their own energy, food, and water resources. Today, that dream is becoming a reality at the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a 705-acre regenerative agriculture community located at the Florida-Georgia line near Folkston, Georgia. The farm is known as the healthiest place on earth, and it includes orchards, organic standing gardens, regenerative animal pastures, berry fields, and much, much more. Today, the farm features 25 custom-built cabins and has plans to construct 225 more in the years ahead. The farm has its own food, energy, and water sources and is completely off-grid. So if you're looking to join a Citadel community comprised of sovereign individuals, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about membership. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on custom cabin pricing. Again, that's okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove.
You know, we get to the point of land being no longer super abundant and becoming scarce because we've increased the carrying capacity of the planet, right? We've actually increased the population to the point that now land is scarce, but we increased the population to that point via the institution of private property. But you're saying when we get to that point, we should now abolish private property and land. I'm having a hard time following that logic.
I'm saying that private property and land should never have existed in the first place.
Then we would have never, then land would never have become scarce. And we would not have increased the human population to 8.5 billion people.
I don't follow that reasoning at all. If we had implemented a Gesellian system from day one, which was to say that we recognize, and this is very much in keeping with the practices and the values of Native American cultures. For example, they considered land to be something that cannot be owned, and that is naturally community, naturally belongs to the community. So I would say that this value system is far more grounded in the totality of human history than is the institution of private land ownership, which is relatively recent.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd still have my argument about territoriality there. I think territoriality is one of the most ancient. I mean, it is so essential to being a social organism that it's hard to imagine a world in which social creatures aren't territorial to some extent. We all need to have an exclusive space to accumulate resources, build a family, raise offspring, all of these things. Like, I don't know how you can have that without private property. I mean, it sounds like in this Gesellian view that we would just abdicate all of that responsibility and thinking to some monopoly on violence, and they would just tell us, hey, you can lease what you need, but you can't own it. All right, so how, in that world, how do you deal with the agency problem? How do you keep, so we've now vested absolute power in the government to facilitate this competitive leasing process in a free market fashion. How do you prevent the government from not following the rules? This is the classic question in all libertarianism, right? Like, how do you guard the guardians? How do you prevent those in a position of power from becoming corrupt and bending, twisting, ignoring the rules to their own individual favor at the expense of others? Like, how do you deal with the agency problem in this world?
Well, I would say you just jumped from the realm of economics to the realm of politics, and Gesell was an economist, and I consider myself a student of economics. So I don't feel compelled to be able to answer that question, because it's like, asking a biologist to solve a chemistry problem.
Well, see, I don't know that it's outside the realm of economics, because the agency problem is also largely solved through the institution of private property. Or if you own shares in a company and the CEO embezzles money, well, then you can, now this is notwithstanding limited liability, corporate structures and all that, right? And let's just say it's a sole proprietorship for argument's sake. You can now sue that individual for engaging in criminal activity. You can get recourse to the private property the embezzler owns as a means of penalizing him, and thus imputing a risk and a cost to criminal activity. So that agency problem is solved via the rule of law and private property. If you strip that out, then how do you handle the agency problem?
Again, I'm not going to answer your question. All I'm going to say is that what I hear you advocating for is law of the jungle, might makes right. If I'm stronger and have a more territorial drive than you do, and I'm capable of preventing you from occupying my space, then I've got an enforceable claim to it.
No. I would not be advocating for that whatsoever. Be advocating for constitutional republic. Right? You have rights to life, liberty, and property. These are God-given. Government cannot interfere or encroach with them. So if you have established ownership in land via consensual trade or original homesteading, as we said earlier, then you own the thing. It doesn't mean I'm the strongest guy in the room, therefore I've got the land. It means according to the laws of the land, life, liberty, and property, I own this thing because I am the one
but that is,
that
you're
appropriated it
answering
from nature or traded from someone who did appropriate it from nature, presumably somewhere down the line.
Sure, but you're solving the agency problem via the institution of government, and I'm doing the same thing.
Well, via the institution of government, private property can exist independent of government, but government exists to preserve life, liberty, and property. So
how can private property exist independent of government?
Bitcoin exists. Bitcoin exists independent of government, and it's private property. If I have gold buried in my backyard that I exclusively own, control, know the location of, then I have private property in that gold exclusive of the government.
But what does private property mean?
A relationship between owner and asset.
Is there an enforceability, or is it possession? Or see, there's an important distinction between possession and property.
Yes.
Proudhon, I believe, was the one who focused on that in his book "What Is Property?" And yes, possession is a physical fact.
Yeah.
Property, I would argue,
It's a legally acknowledged form of that. That's correct, unless it's a bearer asset, right? If you own, and if you want to
that's still just possession. That's not
it is
property.
still just possession. But if you possess a physical asset, then you are presumed to be the rightful owner of it.
That you just crossed over into a framework that presupposes the existence of an authority, and that's government.
Well, then semantically, every time you invoke the term rightful owner, there's two different forms of rightful. Could be the morally just owner, right? Whoever appropriated it and actually earned it, or then there's the legally recognized one. Once you say legally recognized, once there's rule of law, there is government. Actually, that's not entirely true. You can have private laws, private courts, all these things. But in our current world, rule of law presupposes government.
Right.
So it depends on which form of ownership you're describing. When I was saying rightful owner, I was invoking the moral dimension.
I'm just trying to decide in the moment how far afield we want to be going.
Yeah, we can go back wherever you want to go.
All right, let me just make one last point.
Let's agree to disagree on private property and land.
I would like to agree to that disagreement, but I want to make one last case on that point, which comes from personal experience. My uncle, when he was a young man, bought a used Porsche. And when he bought it, he noted that the rubber, I don't know what it's called, the thing that surrounds the window, window casing. Yeah, the rubber seal had a slice in it. And that made him suspect that the car might have been stolen. But he overlooked that. He bought the car. It later came to light that it had in fact been stolen. And he had to relinquish his property, his rightful ownership, even though he had paid for the car, because the original claim to property was illegitimate.
Right.
And no number of subsequent sales of an illegitimate piece of property can legitimize an illegitimate claim to property. And I would say the same applies to ownership of land. And again, we're going to agree to disagree. I'm good with that. But I want to just draw out the logic that if you take the position that the original appropriation is illegitimate because it is not founded on the basis of human labor, then no number of subsequent transfers of that claim can make it legitimate.
But you said the original appropriation is illegitimate because it's not based on human labor, but how do you homestead without human labor?
You have a right to the improvements. You have a right to the fence. You have a right to the house.
Yeah, even the homesteading process itself, just showing up at the piece of land saying, no one's using this, this is mine now, that is human labor. But well, you're right, I'm too far afield. We'll just agree to disagree. On your uncle's thing, though, wouldn't he have had legal recourse to the selling party? If someone sold him a piece of stolen property, then they owe him the money back, and then so on and so forth down that chain.
Yeah, who is that person in reality? That person is a druggie who has already spent the money. And so, yes, there's a legal claim, but there's no practical recourse.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's an argument against private property, though. That's just an argument.
It's just an illustration of the fact that no number of subsequent transfers of an initially illegitimate claim to property can legitimize it.
True. And this also points to a deeper problem with the entire structure, because if you go back far enough in time, human history is an absolute bloodbath of people stealing land and stuff from one another time and time again forever, right? Since the dim mist of history. At some point, we have to just say a group or a person or a individual had rightful ownership to this property and roll it forward. Otherwise, I guess the other approach would be to cede all of the ownership claims to one authority, which if it's not the government, I don't know what else it would be. Whatever authority you ceded it to would become the government. They would become the de facto government because they have all of the power, right?
Yes.
And once you've done that, you've now ceded all the control to the biggest land thief of them all, which is the government itself. So it just seems circular and oxymoronic to me.
I can see how it seems that way to you. I think that what I said before is if we switch in and switch out the word community for government, that it sounds and feels quite different. Yeah. And I understand your orientation of being very suspicious of central authority. I am too.
Yeah.
But
there's also the information problem. Then I still don't think I think that's insurmountable. That if we just say, oh, the community owns this. So then, okay, again, I know you said he advocates for no national boundaries. So that would be one world government or landowner, whatever we're going to call this.
Let's do it in the context of a country. Just
that's
to keep
what I was going to say. So we're just in the United States. Then every transfer of every deed of every piece of land now needs to go through an approval process where 330 million, I guess minors wouldn't be doing this, right? It'd just be adults, perhaps. So maybe 250 million Americans need to sign.
Why does it need to be approved?
Well, they all own it. How are you going to sell it without approval of the owner?
How do you issue a speeding ticket without an approval of all 330 million members of society? That's what government does.
That's the state. There's no violation of private property for speeding. That's just the state extracting from you.
But it is practically executable without getting the approval of every member of the society.
Well, that's because it's statism. It's not government. It's not the community issuing you that speeding ticket. Do you get dividends from speeding tickets as a citizen of the United States? Or any state for that matter?
I don't know. I'd have to see the flow of. I'd have to see the flow of those.
I'll save you the time. That money goes to the coffers of the state, the same state that collects taxes, inflates currencies, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no
right, but they might spend that on building a school,
whatever they spend it on,
building a road.
It's stolen. So there's no legitimate claim to the property.
Okay, that's again. We keep coming back to this point upon which
I guess the point is that information problem that I was trying to highlight is overcome by a centralized power structure in the case of a speeding ticket. They don't get the approval from everyone else. They just write the ticket, enforce the collections on that ticket, and then enjoy the benefits from the proceeds of that ticket.
Right.
There is no distribution out to the community whatsoever.
Where we agree is that in order for any such system to be practically realizable, it has to take some concrete form, and that concrete form could be a constitutional democracy. It could be an absolute monarchy. It could be, any of the various forms of government that humans have thought of or will think of. But yes, it requires some instantiation of authority, for sure.
Has to be backstopped by violence or the threat thereof, which is the unfortunate reality of, again, social organisms. We only respond to force at the end of the day. Should we go to money?
Sure.
So the other concepts, well, I don't know. Where do we start here? You said free money was his solution to what? Is it Demurrage? No, Demurrage is separate.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about money. Let's just talk about, please give me his perspective on money.
Sure. So your program is called What is Money? And
It's a great question.
it's a great question. The most textbook answer is that it is an instrument with three functions: store, medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. Gesell's insight was that the medium of exchange and store of value functions are inherently incompatible. That any instrument which is designed to perform those two functions will automatically fail to perform at least one, if not both of them. And therefore, his solution was to say, why do they need to be performed by one instrument?
Can you tell me why that is? Why is it inevitable that it cannot perform both of those functions? An asset cannot perform both of those functions.
Because the nature of the physical universe is one in which virtually all forms of physical, tangible wealth lose value with the passage of time. And
they decay. I wouldn't say lose value, because that introduces the subjective side of
sure,
things.
yeah, value is a very tricky word, and we can try to replace it with something else.
But most things physically decay over time. Yes,
right.
Granted.
How do you deal with that fact? The most effective solution to the problem of entropy, which is the root phenomenon, is circulation. How do you ensure that this gallon of milk that I'm in possession of does not go bad? You consume it. You circulate it. You get it to someone who needs it before it spoils. And therefore, in order, and that is just the nature of the physical universe. Any, virtually all forms of physical wealth will decay, or see, the reason decay is problematic for me is that there are other very important ways in which value, and I recognize that that's a problematic word, decreases with the passage of time. For example, obsolescence, right? Gesell uses the extreme example of a newspaper. A newspaper loses all of its value in 24 hours.
The information specifically, right?
Nobody's going to
so
buy
much-
yesterday's newspaper.
Not so much the commodity value of the paper, but the information printed on the paper declines.
Nobody's going to
rapidly.
pay for it.
Yeah,
the market
information,
value
for sure
goes from
because once the information's out, it's absorbed by the market. And there's no more asymmetry.
right, and the same principle applies just at varying rates to an automobile, to a computer, to a piece of
technological obsolescence.
Yeah. So that's why decay
Obsolescence.
is not the most universal way of encompassing that general phenomenon.
So this is true for consumable goods and capital goods.
And human labor. If
Is
you
it true for human labor? Does that, well, individually, yes, at the individual scale, but the aggregate supply of human labor could expand over time via population growth.
right, but you as an individual, if you do not successfully sell your labor and successfully feed yourself, then you will physically decline and you will die. So the way that you deal with that is circulation, is by selling your labor, by selling the product of your labor, and with the proceeds, attaining the proceeds of other people's labor and using it to sustain yourself. So the principle of maintaining wealth in an entropic universe is circulation.
The circulation you're using as synonymous with consumption, it sounds like.
No.
Because if you just, if we just say, I have a bunch of oranges, right? And they are going to degrade over time. They're going to rot. The fruit will rot because that's what fruit does. If we just start trading those amongst ourselves a lot, we haven't overcome the entropy that's going to destroy the oranges. We're just circulating oranges. It's kind of like a game of hot potato. So the
consumption is one aspect of circulation, but it is not the only aspect of circulation. Investment is another form of circulation. And this is where you and I first connected and first had a disagreement. Mm-hmm. I would say that saving is not an action. Saving is the absence of an action. Saving is the act of not consuming. Investing is an action. Investing is taking certain discrete resources and deploying them in some kind of productive process for the purpose of generating some additional increment of wealth.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com.
Okay, so we go with Mises's definition of action as the purposeful use of means to pursue ends. Saving would be the purposeful setting aside of cash balances or money to enhance your ability to consume in the future, right? You have economic potential energy, if you want to use that definition for monetary savings. Now, there is something beneath that too that's really important. People think, oh, that's just money sitting on the sidelines, it's idle, and there's all these other problems, which I'm sure we'll get into. The reality of that is, though, is presuming you have earned that money honestly and you haven't stolen it from someone, well, then you have added to the productive output of goods and services in society. You went to work and you did something and you were paid in money. If you hold that money in savings, then you have not yet subtracted from the goods and services of society. So you've actually increased aggregate capital stocks and presumably productivity if you've created something that augments human labor positively, which many jobs do in an advanced economy. So that is an action, I would say. Saving is an action. It's a means to the end of increasing your future consumption. Now, investing is taking savings and using it, right? Either if you've just saved up a bunch of oranges, again, to keep it simple, you could consume those oranges as you build a fishing net or a fishing rod, which is a piece of capital that amplifies your future productivity in terms of fishing in this case. The quantity and quality of fish you can catch with a rod and a net, as opposed to catching what you can catch with your bare hands, right? You can catch a lot more variety and quality of fish with the capital goods than you can with your bare hands. But that requires a stock of savings to fund you, to feed you during the investment period of creating the fishing rod and the fishing net. So I think both of those things are actions, according to Mises's definition, at least.
I'm going to stick to my guns on saying that saving is not an action, that you have done the work.
What's your definition of action in this case then?
Okay, you used in our first interaction, you used the example of picking berries. Picking berries is an action. Picking berries is a form of productive human labor. So now you've got a basket full of berries. You could eat the berries, that's consumption, or you could do nothing. That's saving. That is not an action. You could also...
well, holding the berries not an action? You've got them in your basket. Presumably you're storing them in your house somewhere. I mean, they are a means to be drawn upon for the attainment of future ends, as we just said with investing.
Let's say you died in that instant. You would still be doing... The berries would be unaffected. The berries would be in exactly the same circumstances if you were alive or dead, in terms of what happened to the berries. They're just sitting there rotting.
Yeah, I don't think death changes the status of your prior actions, though.
Okay, the point I'm making...
You have to define it for me, first of all. Like how do you define action?
How do I define action?
Yeah.
That's a metaphysical question. We have to look at individual instances of action. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a metaphysician. So I don't think that I'm going to be able to give you a comprehensive definition of action. But
well, I mean, we just stick to again, that's...
We can agree that consuming...
economic definition of action. I know there's more, of course, we get into the metaphysics and all that, but just from a purely economic standpoint, Mises would say purposeful use of means to pursue valued ends. And he contrasts action to behavior. Behavior is like a biological reflex. So when the doctor taps your knee and your leg kicks out, well, you didn't premeditate that response, right? You weren't using your body as a means to the end of kicking your leg out. There's just a hard-coded biological response in you that he would call behavior. So that's his distinction. And I'm just curious what yours would be to say that saving is not an action.
Okay. I think, again, all I can do is give examples. Eating the berries, we would agree, is an action. Rather than eating the berries, giving the berries to you, I own the berries, and I'm going to offer them to you to perform some service that is of value to me, is also an action.
As would my acceptance of those berries also be an action. No.
Well, yeah. So both of those are actions: consumption and investment. And those are the two actions that I can conceivably undertake, given my possession of that basket of berries, both of which are forms of circulation, because presumably you're going to then either eat the berries or pass them on to someone else in a similar manner. Saving would mean just letting the berries sit in the basket on the table and rot. It is not an action, and it is not circulation, and it means that the physical laws of the universe are going to cause something that once had value to no longer have value at some point. And it's not going to be long before that happens in the case of berries or in the case of a newspaper. So the principle, again, let's try to bring this back to the incompatibility in the functions of money. The principle is that in order to effectively deal with the entropic nature of the universe, that real wealth needs to circulate. And
I gotta push back on that term again. I don't think circulation fixes it. Again, if we just trade the berries every 2 seconds, you hand them to me, I hand them to someone else, and we just keep doing that, the berries are still rotting as they're circulating. So we didn't pause the entropy of the universe on the berries by trading the berries.
No, they need to be consumed by someone.
Well, they need to be consumed, right? But consumption is the opposite of investment. We also need to invest, and investment has to be funded from savings.
Yes.
So you could even say that savings serves the end of investment, right? Savings is a means to the end of investment. Therefore, savings is an action. I mean, let me ask you this: like, do you have dollars in a bank account? Okay, what are you doing with those? You have no purpose for those?
I'm not doing anything with them.
You own them, presumably. Do you have a purpose for them?
Do I have a purpose for them?
Like, will you do something with them in the future? Will you spend them in the future?
Yes.
Okay, so how is that not an action? They're a means to an end. Whatever you buy with those dollars is the end. You know, you're going to buy a new shirt or whatever. Well, dollars were the means to the end of getting the new shirt. So how was savings not an action in that case?
There may be a future action, but that action will be of the variety of consumption,
Or investment.
Both of which are forms of circulation. The saving itself is letting the berries sit in the basket on the table and rot.
Yeah, I don't think even investment has to be circulation either, because you go back to building the fishing pole or the fishing net. I don't need to circulate to invest in that. If I have the skill and the materials to build a fishing rod, there's no circulation necessary for that.
But there's no investment there either.
That is investment. You're creating a capital good that increases your future productivity. That's what investment is. And I'm deferring consumption, right? I'm going to consume from my savings rather than be actively fishing to build the fishing rod that will increase the quantity and quality of fish I can catch in the future. That's what investment is. And so that's how savings facilitates investment. Anyways, I don't want to get hung up on it, but in the Mises view, I don't see how you could ever possibly argue that anything a human does is not an action other than the behavioral reflex I described earlier. But again, it all comes down to the definition of action. Like, that's how Mises defines action. That's why I was really trying to push you, like, well, how do you define it? Because that is the crux of the matter.
Right. And that's why I said I was not going to be able to give you a general answer. I could only give you specific examples.
Yeah.
And eating berries is an action. And giving berries to someone else as a form of mutually beneficial exchange is an action. We agree about that. Leaving the berries sitting on the table and rotting is saving, but it's not an action. I would say it's the absence of an action. But again, let's bring this back to the discussion of money. We are in agreement that it is a general principle of an entropic universe that physical wealth, tangible wealth, decays or otherwise suffers loss.
Physical degradation, let's say.
But not, again, obsolescence is not physical degradation. So we need a more general term than physical degradation.
What was the example of obsolescence that's
a
not
newspaper.
Physical degradation? Oh, that's information, so that's non-scarce.
Or last year's car.
Yeah, that's physical degradation, isn't it?
No, it's the fact that a more recent year model has been introduced.
Okay.
And
so physical or technological degradation.
What about last year's clothing? Why is there a clearance rack in every clothing store?
Or technological, or I guess it's just, well, it's preference. It's just shifting consumer preferences ultimately. People prefer fresh fruit to rotten fruit, new cars to old cars, and new clothes to old clothes.
Right. So I'm not sure that the perfect word exists to encompass all of those different ways. And that's why the word value, even though you and I agree it's problematic,
right,
is sometimes useful.
Yes.
Just to hold a conversation.
Yeah. Okay. So physical wealth tends to go obsolete. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Over time.
So let's go to the cliched economist's story of how money represents an evolution from barter. I'm not convinced that that's accurate description of actual human history, but that's a story that is told over and over again in economics textbooks. So let's start before the introduction of money in a barter economy composed only of real goods and services. You produce oranges, I produce milk. We exchange, we negotiate exchanges. No one tells us how many oranges are worth how many gallons of milk. We determine that between ourselves via free negotiation as self-sovereign individuals, so to speak. But both of our possessions compel circulation, because if either one of us or if both of us fail to reach a mutually agreeable transaction, we are both going to lose value due to physical decay. So there is a very powerful compulsion to circulate real wealth. In a barter economy, that force applies to everyone in every single transaction. And that makes it much more likely that a successful negotiation will conclude. But again, there is no one forcing either one of us to accept the terms being offered. It is the nature of our possessions, of our wealth, that punishes us if we don't finally reach an agreement.
Yes.
So now let's introduce money. Let's introduce gold money. Gold neither rots nor decays nor rusts. Gold is this anomalous form of physical matter that does not follow the physical laws that apply to 99% of physical matter. Gesell's argument is that when you introduce this form of wealth, which can be withheld from circulation without loss, that you do two things. One, you make it less likely that a successful negotiation will be concluded, because one party is no longer being compelled by the physical nature of his property to conclude a successful negotiation. If I'm the one holding the gold coin, I don't lose anything if we don't reach an agreement. I can come back tomorrow without having lost anything. That is me using money as a store of value, of a store of wealth. It would be, so this introduction of a medium of exchange, which is also perfectly storable, would be as if we repealed the laws of physics, of nature, as it applies to one side of each barter transaction. So in our previous example, where you've got the oranges and I've got the milk, And let's say in this barter, in the barter example, we came to the conclusion that that a half dozen oranges is equal to 1 gallon of milk. We agreed to that exchange. We made that exchange. We both agreed that it was mutually beneficial. If we now repeal the laws of physics as it applies to my milk, so my milk will no longer spoil. And now we start that negotiation a second time. We're not going to end up at the same ratio of exchange that we arrived at under the first circumstances, because I know two things. I know that I can go home with my milk and suffer no loss, and I know that you cannot do that. And therefore, the inherently level playing field of a barter transaction has been made very unlevel. And I am going to use that leverage to get a better deal. I'm going to get more than 6 oranges from you in exchange for my gallon of milk, because my gallon of milk is no longer subject to the laws of nature.
Okay, so I think there's a bit of categorical confusion going on here, and it's very common as it pertains to money, because it's even in the terminology, right? We say storehold of wealth or store of value, when in fact you can't store value, right? You can't physically put value in a box and store it. You can physically store wealth, which would be, a box of oranges or a gallon of milk. Like, these are physical forms of wealth that can be consumed. These are savings, basically, right? These are goods that have been produced but not yet consumed. This is real economic savings that money symbolizes, right? Money is not the wealth. Money is a symbol of wealth. Money is the map. Wealth is the territory, so to speak. And as you're describing that scenario, there was a subtle change where you talked about holding the money, right? The gold, in this case, that does not suffer physical degradation, although it is subject to technological obsolescence, thanks to Bitcoin, but we'll leave that aside for now. You're holding the map to wealth. You are not holding the territory of wealth. We could also call this like the menu in the food, as Alan Watts likes to say, mistaking the menu for the food. Money is the menu. Wealth, goods, services, these are the food, right? These are the things that you actually can choose from to acquire via the menu, which is money. Obviously, this is an analogy. You don't have to cut up pieces of the menu and trade it for food. You just use it. But anyways, when I hold gold and I hold something that does not suffer physical degradation, that is not equivalent to me holding the milk that does not spoil. I'm holding something else. I'm holding money. I'm holding a claim to future goods. I'm not holding the goods themselves, right? So, and again, assuming I've earned that money honestly, that I didn't steal the gold from someone, I didn't seize it from their vault or their country or their treasure trove, whatever it may be, and I went into the marketplace and rendered services that other people deemed to be valuable enough to pay me in gold, then I added to the output of aggregate goods and services. So I've increased human capital stocks. And again, if I produce capital goods, I increase human productivity. I was paid in gold, which is potential goods. It's not actual goods. It's not the milk. It's not the oranges, but it's potential milk and oranges. If someone will trade with me in the future, assuming someone will trade with me, will trade their milk and oranges for my gold in the future, right? Which is, there's a bit of trust there. We don't know. There's some uncertainty. Then I have not gained any undue leverage whatsoever. And I'm not hoarding any actual wealth. I'm hoarding, saving money. I have economic savings. I have a claim to other goods and services that have been produced but not yet consumed. But I don't have them. I don't physically have the milk or the oranges. I just have a claim to future milk and oranges. So that's my first issue with that. Like, you can't subtly say, oh, if you had this milk that didn't spoil, that's equivalent to holding gold. No, milk does not equal gold, right? That's one. Two, A barter economy suffers from the non-coincidence of wants problem, right? If I have milk and you have oranges, but you don't want milk and I don't want oranges, well, then we're fucked, right? We need to go trade for something we both want, something that has more moneyness, like maybe water, that you could trade your, whichever ones, your milk for water and I trade my oranges for water. And then all of a sudden we can, or one of us trades for water and the other one wants water, then we could trade your milk for my water, whatever it may be. That actually opens up the intensity, the number of trading partners, the intensity of free exchange, the scope of trade, as economists call it, that you actually gain a lot more trading partners by being able to denominate all of your transactions in one language of economic numeracy, if we want to call money that for this instance, right? That we can all think in terms of this money, we can negotiate, we can perform economic calculation in terms of this money, we can execute trades in terms of this money, so that we overcome the non-coincidence of wants problem. And that has three different dimensions, right? It's, you may not want the same goods in the same place as me, you may not want the same goods at the same time as me, or you may not want the same amount of goods at the same scale, right? If you're trading oranges for a house, for instance, that might be way more oranges than I want as a homeowner. It'd be a lot easier if you could just pay me in money and then I could take that money into the marketplace and buy all the milk and oranges and whatever else that I want. So absent money, you get a collapse in the scope of trade. You get a collapse in the intensity and frequency of free exchange. I think that's a direct corollary to wealth creation, right? The more people are able to trade and the more quickly they can trade, the more reliably they can store air quotes, purchasing power into the future, the more they can accumulate savings that can then be used for future consumption or investment, the more we grow the economy.
Yes.
So that is that would be my answer to that, is there is no issue whatsoever. And this gets probably into the savings versus hoarding issue. Savings is what underpins the process of economization and thus civilization. That if you don't have savings, you don't have investment. If you don't have investment, you don't have increasing human productivity. If you don't have increasing human productivity, you don't have increasing capital stocks. If you don't have increasing capital stocks, you don't have civilization. So that's my rendition of the libertarian argument on that.
Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware's mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few strokes of the keyboard. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your miner's energy bill for the first week of each of your mining rigs when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-key vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control over your keys. Your funds are fully auditable on-chain, cannot be rehypothecated, and can only move or be withdrawn at your explicit direction. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. Bitcoin is money, and as the price continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly tap into financial services like trading, inheritance, insurance, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security or accessibility. Schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team to learn more at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove.
I want to take a couple of steps backward, but first I want to clarify my position on saving. My position on saving is that we cannot know in any specific instance if the act, if it is an action or not. We've gone through that. If saving is beneficial or harmful to society cannot be known unless we also know if there is a corresponding act of investment. If there is a corresponding act of investment, then it is beneficial for society. If there is not a corresponding act of investment, then it can be harmful to society. So saving.
How can savings harm society?
By simply letting the basket of blueberries rot.
Well, if I went out into the marketplace and I worked, again, provided goods and services and took my payment in money and then used my money to buy the blackberries that then rotted. Okay, I didn't hurt society. I added goods and services
but you're part of
to
society.
Right. I hurt myself if I let my own blackberries rot.
Right. So society as a whole lost.
Well, okay. Well, sure. But it's in my self-interest to not let my blackberries rot, to make sure that they get consumed because I worked for them.
Right. And
this is where the skin in the game element of private property is so important. It's like when you, the individual actor, incurs the consequences of their own actions, that's how you get good outcomes.
Yeah.
If you make a decision that I bear the consequences of, a la money printing, right? When the central bank prints money, they make a decision that they benefit from, and all of the cost is externalized onto savers. That's a problem. The central banker lacks skin in the game, and you get a very destructive, pathologized institution. But when individual entrepreneurs actually bear the consequences of their actions, then you get good outcomes, right? I'm going to be prudent with the blackberries that I earned because I worked my ass off to earn them.
And Silvio Gesell would agree with all of that completely. However, I'm not making any value judgment when I say that failure to circulate those berries results in a net loss to society.
You would say
That's just a physical
failure to consume the berries.
Failure to circulate them.
Well, failure to consume before they rot. I don't need to circulate them. If I bought all the berries and I consume them, well, then society wasn't hurt because.
But that's a circulation that you put that into your organism.
No, that's consumption. That's consumption.
That's a subcategory of circulation.
No, okay. So we got to get the definitions again here. In economics, they would define circulation as exchange. So I trade. Berries went from my possession to your possession, or my ownership to your ownership. That's circulation. Consumption is when you use an asset. I consume it. Even sitting in this house right now, we're both consuming the house. We're consuming the space. We're consuming there's depreciation occurring, right? So there's this little bit of consumption we're having. Food is a more obvious example. As you eat the food, you're consuming it. It's providing for your metabolism and all of this. So I think, again, in the libertarian viewpoint, there's a strict delineation between consumption and circulation. Although in a more metaphysical sense, of course, when you eat blackberries, well, eventually you're going to circulate them out into the toilet, right? Of course, there's that, but
and the loss of them rotting is avoided by the fact that you ate them and you gave your body nutrition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying, that you don't need circulation to prevent the loss. You need consumption.
And I'm saying that consumption is a subcategory of circulation.
Okay. I would always often also have to disagree with that for the reasons I just laid out.
Okay. Let's go back to money, division of labor.
Okay.
Because I think I want to find common ground here, because I believe that my reason for being here is to persuade you that Silvio Gesell agrees with you, even though you don't see it that way yet. So presumably you're familiar with the Adam Smith example of the pin factory in The Wealth of Nations.
Yeah.
To me, that is the perfect illustration of the principle of the division of labor.
Sure.
And it is the reason why I believe, and I would expect you probably also believe, that money is the most important tool ever invented by man.
Yeah, I think it is on par with natural language, but I'm not so sure we invent it as much as it emerges. You know, did we invent natural language? I don't know. So yeah, again, terminologically, it's either it just emerges as part of what we are, or maybe we invented it, but it doesn't seem like it was consciously invented.
Okay, but let's keep our eye on the ball and focus on the division of labor.
Yeah.
For those viewing this who may not have read that part of the Wealth of Nations.
The division of labor is the reason we coalesce into societies, right? That we benefit through exchange. It's a win-win, basically.
Yes.
It's a positive sum game that we all play. We all benefit from.
It's not just a win-win. It's an enormous win-win.
Yes.
And that's the key point that I think we want to establish some common ground on. So for those who have not read that passage of The Wealth of Nations, let me just briefly summarize it. Adam Smith says that he has, with his own eyes, witnessed the functioning of a factory where they were manufacturing pins, where 10 people were working with crude tools, and where he observed the principle of the division of labor. And he said that any one of those 10 people working alone to make pins could make between 1 and 20 pins in a day. But that through the division of labor, through dividing up the steps in the process of manufacturing a pin, these 10 people could make 48,000 pins in a day.
Yes.
And a tenth of that being the average produce of labor of one of those 10 individuals is 4,800 pins.
Right. So from 20 per capita to 4,800 per capita via economic specialization, that each person specializes in one phase of the sequence of production rather than being a generalist across all 10 steps.
Right. Yeah. That's the division of labor. And that's, and the, besides the principle is also the magnitude. The magnitude is huge.
Yes.
The difference between 1 pin and 4,800 pins, or between 20 pins and 4,800 pins at either end of the spectrum of what individual effort is capable of, it's still 99.9% of the amount of wealth owes its existence to human collaboration.
Yes, more than, in that case, you're more than 200xing your output.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's where I have a problem extending the Mises paradigm of analyzing individual human behavior and building an understanding of society on that foundation. I would say that it could be compared to the difference between subatomic physics and macro level physics. As you may be aware, if we analyze the behavior of subatomic particles, there is inherent uncertainty, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that you cannot at one point in time know both the position and velocity of an electron.
Yeah.
But at the macro level, when we bring together large numbers of inherently uncertain instances,
Yeah.
they manifest into things which can be known with practical certainty, but
Right.
not complete mathematical certainty.
Right. Yes.
There is a quantum difference between the nature of reality at the subatomic level versus the macro physical level. And I would say the same is true in the economic sphere, that the difference between one of those 10 people working by himself to make between 1 and 20 pins in a day versus 10 people working together to make 48,000 pins in a day means that the logic that applies in the case of individual self-sufficient production cannot be automatically assumed to apply at the macro level. That
You think it's diminished or it's increased?
it's just different. It's different to the point that I would agree that an individual working on a desert island to provide for his own survival or making pins, whatever the case may be, has no obligation toward anyone other than himself. But as soon as we cross over into a reality in which we are providing for our material needs via the division of labor, I would say that no longer applies. That if you, all right, so let's say you and I are stuck on a desert island, and let's make a really simple model. There are two goods that we both need to produce and consume in order to survive: food and drink. There are two ways that we can go about that. We can both go our own ways and both produce food and drink for ourselves, or we can avail ourselves of the principle of division of labor and split up the work, and you make food and I make drink, and we exchange our surplus. And the division of labor principle says that we'll both be better off by doing it that way. But as soon as we cross over, as soon as we make what I consider to be a quantum leap from self-sufficient individual production and consumption to collaborative production and consumption via the division of labor, we have both put our very survival in the other's hands.
Sure.
So I would say that the principle of the self-sufficient, the self-sovereign individual, which I think is an important concept for your worldview, cannot be applied in absolute terms once that quantum leap has been made.
Again, back to definitions. Largely inspired by the book The Sovereign Individual. This does not mean if you are a quote unquote sovereign individual that you are not interdependent with a trade network. Doesn't mean that you're excluded from the division of labor. So I don't think those things are mutually incompatible. The sovereign individual is someone who basically has perfected private property rights, right? They're not getting stolen from by a state or anyone else. That's the ideal. So if anything, that actually allows you to participate more deeply in the division of labor, does not exclude you from it. So just a clarification on that point.
Okay. Perhaps I used that term incorrectly.
But you are correct that, once you're engaged in the division of labor, you are enjoying the increased productivity that it affords you. But there is an interdependence occurring on other producers, right? I didn't build this house. I didn't build this microphone. I didn't build this table. I didn't build the computer, right? I'm dependent on all of the vast numbers of people and supply chains that brought these things to me.
Right.
But again, the beauty, and then Adam Smith, he goes into this, how, it's not the, what does he say? It's not the good-heartedness of the baker that bakes the bread, right? It's his self-interest that he's baking the bread for others, because there's an alignment of self-interest in a trade network that is facilitating the social division of labor that Mises would argue is only possible with the institution of private property. So, not to get back into private property, but yes, that is, I guess the main clarification is, to be a sovereign individual does not mean you do not participate in the division of labor. If anything, it means you participate in it more fully and wholly because you have stronger private property.
Okay. It might have been a mistake for me to use the term sovereign individual because I may not fully understand the implications of that. But the point that I was trying to make is that as soon as we make the transition from individual self-sufficient production and consumption to collaborative production and consumption via the division of labor, we have put our survival in each other's hands.
Yes.
And let's now go back to the principle of saving. Let's think about what saving would look like in that very simplified model. So you're making the food, I'm making the drink. Let's add some conditions. Let's say that if we each operate independently, let's say that each of us needs to consume 10 units of food and 10 units of drink to survive. And let's say that if we do not work together, it takes all of our waking hours to each produce the 10 units of food and the 10 units of drink that we need to survive. So we are living a complete subsistence existence.
Yeah.
There is no surplus. There is no leeway.
Wow.
And now the principle of the division of labor occurs to us, and we realize that if you make all of the food and I make all of the drink, we can produce the 20 units of each that we need. And let's just specify that by doing that, we each get 2 hours of free time a day.
Yeah, I think it'd be 4 hours if they're 8-hour days, but yes, we've basically cut our workday in half to subsist, and we have the other half of the workday to invest or to spend in leisure.
Right.
Yeah.
In order to reap that benefit, there is an implied agreement that exchange is going to take place. I'm going to give you the 10 units of drink that I don't need to sustain myself in exchange for the 10 units of food that you produced but don't need for yourself.
Correct.
And we're both going to survive as a result. And we're both going to reap the reward of efficiencies in the productive process. And that takes the form of some leisure that we can each choose to use as we please. Now, what would it mean for me to save in that very simplified context? It would simply mean that I produce 20 units of drink per day. I consume 10 of them. I've got 10 left. I'm going to economize. I'm going to save. I'm only going to offer 8 units for exchange in our free market. You now cannot get the 10 units of drink that you need to survive through exchange. And therefore, you need to abandon the division of labor and go back to producing drink for yourself in order to survive. So I would argue that the act of saving in that very simplified set of circumstances essentially just represents a rejection of the principle of division of labor.
Yeah, I would disagree there, because what you've done through the division of labor is you have reduced your 8-hour workday of subsistence to a 4-hour workday of subsistence, right? As we described. Do you agree with that, at least?
Sure.
Okay. I was going rough math. You said 10 units, it goes up to 20 units. Presumably that cuts the workday in half, right? So instead of working a full 8 hours just to meet my basic food and drink needs, once we engage in the division of labor, we now each only need to engage in 4 hours of labor to meet our 10 units each of drink and food needs, right?
Okay. I mean,
So the what you've done is liberated the other 4 hours of your workday. You can spend that sitting in a hammock, or, well, you probably don't have a hammock in these conditions, laying on the beach doing nothing. That would be leisure. Or you could spend those hours doing something productive, right? Building the fishing rod, the fishing net, producing more food, producing more drink, whatever the thing is. And that excess of consumable goods or capital goods that you've created is savings. So I don't think division of labor, I think division of labor is actually, again, you're amplifying human productivity through the division of labor. So you're actually facilitating a greater accumulation of savings. It is not mutually exclusive with saving. I think it's the exact opposite. It's an amplifier of our ability to save.
if the implicit agreement of exchange is honored on both sides, as soon as I no longer make available to you the product that you need for your survival but don't make for yourself.
Yeah, you go from 10 units to 8 units. Well, then now all of a sudden, presumably I'm going to do the same, right?
Right.
I'm not going to give you 10 units of food for 8 units of drink. I'm going to give you 8 units. So it hurts you as much as it hurts me.
Right.
And then we've gone from a 100% division of labor economy to an 80% division of labor economy. To where now, to produce those last 2 units, you're doing it less efficiently because I've specialized in it and you haven't, and vice versa.
Well, I would argue that it means that the entire principle of division of labor breaks down, because you're not going to survive if you continue.
But it contravenes your own self-interest. So why would, I mean, we don't see this in the real economy. We don't see people abandoning the division of labor because it's so hyper productive. And so why, we don't see people abandoning the division of labor, and we don't see a collapse in real output or savings. So where are you going with this?
Where I'm going with this is that the condition that the entire division of labor principle is built upon is the assumption that exchange is going to take place. And if that assumption is violated, then the foundations of the dynamic break down, and we have to both return to individual self-sufficient production.
I agree with that. However, it contradicts your individual self-interest to make that violation. So why would anyone do that?
Well, in that case, you wouldn't. But it is the example is for the purpose of illustrating the point that there is an implied contract, even if we never make it explicit.
Yeah, there's interdependence, I would call it.
Yes.
I don't know that I'd call it an implied, sure, implicit contract. There's an assumption, there's an expectation. I'm going to produce these extra 10 units of drink that I don't need, and the guy traded me his 10 units of food for it last week. I assume he's going to do it again next week.
Right.
Right. There's that for sure. But I don't see why there would ever be a conscious violation of that, because that would hurt me as much as it hurts you.
Right. And that's why you and I both subscribe to the free market system, because we recognize the enormous benefits that we both reap by participating in something where we are both putting our survival in the other's hands. We and that's what I'm referring to as a quantum leap in which the principles that would be understood to operate at the individual level of human action cannot necessarily be extended to form the basis of understanding and governing the dynamics of a system of collaborative production and exchange.
Okay, so this is my earlier question too. All right, we started with Adam Smith and the pen factory, right? There's 10 steps to pen production in this hypothetical example. If each individual facilitates all 10 steps themselves, they produce 20 pens per day or whatever it was. But if they chop up that process into 10 segments and each individual specializes in 1/10 of that process, then they produce 4,800 pens per person per day,
Right.
whatever the equivalent time unit was, hour, day, whatever it may be. Okay. The principle of the division of labor further says that if you scale that up to 100 people and you split that process up into 100 segments now, and each person specialized in each one of those segments, that you'd increase that pen production capacity per head or per capita even more.
Right.
So where is that what you're taking issue with here?
No.
Okay, so what are you saying bad about the division of labor? What are you saying? Where does it break down?
I'm not saying anything bad about the division of
Where
labor.
where does it break down? Because it seems like if you increase collaboration and specialization further in terms of number of participants, that the productivity generated by the division of labor actually goes up.
Yes, we're on the same page about that.
Okay.
So
when does it fail, I guess is my question.
it fails when money, the medium of exchange, is used to perform the other function, which is store of wealth. When I withhold money from circulation, the word that I would say triggered you in our first exchange was the word hoarding, which is a word that I these days try not to use because it seems to imply a value judgment that I do not intend. When I use the word hoarding, all I mean is withholding from circulation. There is no moral judgment as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Which is, if that's the exclusive definition of hoarding, that is indistinguishable from saving.
Right.
Because that's what saving is, the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So saving is hoarding.
Yes. Okay.
If we define hoarding.
Right.
And
Hoarding just has the negative connotation where that saving does not.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll point out that Mises himself uses the word hoarding.
Yes. There's an intentionality beneath it, but the actual economic implications of the act are indistinguishable.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is where we get back to Gesell and his assertion that these two functions, medium of exchange and store of wealth, are incompatible, and that they cannot both be performed effectively by one instrument. And therefore, so Gesell, as I said, was developing this theory in the 1890s when most of the world was on the gold standard. So he was specifically taking issue with gold money and saying that gold money is an abomination. And gold money, and the mistake inherent in gold money is the human decision to combine those two functions, medium of exchange and store of wealth. And that by fusing the store of wealth function onto the instrument, which is a human creation for the purpose of unleashing this massive exponential increase in wealth, in quality of life that is made possible through economic collaboration.
Yeah, the oil to the division of labor machinery.
Yes.
Yeah.
That adding the store of wealth function to the medium of exchange is poisoning the process. And we will need to, how much time do we have?
40 minutes.
40 minutes. So I'm trying, we have to pick and choose because we don't have, if 40 minutes is not enough time.
Well, we should probably just pursue this one all the way to the bottom, I think, because it sounds to be fundamental. I don't exactly know where to start, but maybe we could just, first of all, actually, could we do a 5-minute break? I'm going to do a pee break. But my question to you is going to be, which you can think about in the meantime, how could you practically separate those two functions?
Perfect. Let's resume with that.
All right.
One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Knowing when to buy Bitcoin can feel complicated, and knowing how much to buy can be overwhelming, and getting started can be a headache, but it doesn't have to be. That's exactly why I recommend Coinbits, because it solves these major blockers and it's the easiest way to buy Bitcoin. With Coinbits' Round Ups feature, you can automatically convert your spare change into Bitcoin while you shop. For example, when you buy a coffee for $3.50, the extra 50 cents is rounded up and it goes straight into Bitcoin. Here's why that's a huge win for you, because you don't have to be a tech wizard or try to time the market just right with Bitcoin. With Coinbits Roundups, you simply set it, shop, and stack sats. And you can set this up in under 2 minutes. Just visit the website, connect your card, and boom, you're buying a little Bitcoin every time you spend money. So stop wasting your time with complicated exchanges or confusing shitcoin apps. Coinbits simplifies your Bitcoin savings strategy. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove. Again, that's coinbits.app/breedlove.
So let's pick up where we left off. And I'm going to now jump to the end of the story to let you know where the destination is. And then I'm going to draw on some fairly lengthy textual references from Gesell's book, The Natural Economic Order, to connect those dots. Okay. Gesell's proposal is what is termed demurrage. Demurrage is a word that comes from the shipping industry, and it refers to a charge which is assessed to users of shipping capacity who use that capacity for longer than was contractually agreed to. So if an owner of a ship that is docked at a port has agreed to be there for 3 days to unload and reload, and they end up being there for 5 days, then they pay a charge, which is called demurrage. His proposal is to apply this principle to money, to impose a fee on hoarding of money. And again, hoarding just means
Saving.
withholding from circulation. What that means is, in his time, that meant with this principle has actually been implemented most famously during the Great Depression in a small town in Austria called Virgil. This was a town with 4,000 people that was suffering from the Great Depression, and the mayor of this town was familiar with Gesell's proposals, and he said, "I think this is a good idea to get our local economy out of the depressed conditions that we're in." And he introduced a complementary currency that depreciated 1% per month. And the way that was accomplished is that people, in order to keep these bills, these notes of currency valid, people had to purchase stamps once a month for 1% of the face value of the bill and stick them on the bill in order for them to remain valid at par value. And this gave rise to what is described as the miracle of Virgil, and because this town's economy almost instantly jumped into motion, and unemployment was greatly reduced, and public revenues were increased, and public works were carried out. Unfortunately, the Austrian central bank got wind of this and shut it down. So the world will never know what would have happened if this system had been allowed to continue. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about what.
Well, I'm just curious how that's different from what a central bank's already doing. They're already depreciating the currency. So what's the difference between this and just fiat currency?
I've written an article about exactly that question, but that would take us. What is the difference between inflation and demurrage is the question that you're asking.
Okay.
And I would say that they are vastly different. But to answer that question would take us.
Okay. So we'll
we
table
have to
that one.
pick and choose.
We'll table that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So demurrage is his proposal for how to separate the medium of exchange and store of wealth functions of money. It is the intention is to create a form of money that is only suitable for performing the medium of exchange function, and nobody is going to use a depreciating banknote that they got to.
Okay. So this is not the elimination of the store of value function. This is just a marginalization of the store of value function. Because again, that's what I was trying to get my head around. Is like, if you hold the money, you receive the money and you hold it for 1 second before you transmit it to someone else. Well, in that 1 second, it is functioning as a store of value.
Right.
So you're saying that you're reducing what would this be? The useful life of the store of value from presumably multiple years to a few months because it's being depreciated.
Yes,
okay. That
correct.
Makes more sense to me.
Cool.
I'm still not agreeing with its benefits, but I see how it could work at least.
Yeah. Okay. That's as much agreement that I could have dreamed of having at this point.
Yeah.
All right. So that's where we're working toward is demurrage, is intentional, pre-planned, consistent reduction in the purchasing power of the medium of exchange.
Is this centrally planned, presumably? Because
Yeah.
Okay.
But, and this is another part of the conversation that maybe if we do this again someday, we'll have a chance to talk about. In the digital age, there are all sorts of possibilities that were not possible at the time Gesell developed these ideas in the realm of crypto, and people from crypto who have become aware of this economic perspective have found me and solicited my collaboration for the purpose of making this case in the crypto world.
All right, to just pre-program it instead of centrally plan and impose it.
Right. So I don't think that acceptance of Gesell automatically means that you have to also accept central authority. I think that digital and crypto technology have made it possible that you could implement these principles without the element of central authority. And that's a pretty exciting prospect. And there are crypto projects that have already implemented this, this principle.
Sure.
I don't think any of them have done it properly yet because it's quite technically complex how you do it. But it's out there in the crypto sphere, so to speak. All right. So now I want to take several steps back from Demurrage, and I want to read some lengthy portions of Gesell's book in which he describes the problems arising from facilitating exchange with a hoardable instrument. Okay? So he starts by describing what he would call the unlevel playing field that exists between producers of real goods and services on one side and holders of hoardable money on the other side. Okay? He writes, newsboys shout and run because their wares are unsaleable a few hours after production. The milkman's cart is provided with bells because he must make his sales to the hour and minute. The vegetable woman is the earliest riser of God's creatures. She awakens the sleeping roosters. The butcher cannot afford to oversleep himself or to close his shop during the Whitsun holidays, for in 24 hours his wares would be on the verge of putrefaction. Bakers can sell their wares at the regular price only as long as the loaves are warm. Or take wage earners, the 10,000 battalions of workmen. Are they not as hurried as the newsboy, the vegetable seller, the farmer? If they do not work, part of their assets, their capability to work, is lost with every beat of the pendulum. The possessor of wares is commanded by them under threat of punishment to seek the market. And the punishment is carried out by the wares themselves. The offer of a ware for sale depends, therefore, not upon the will of its possessor, but upon the ware itself. Supply cannot be postponed. Quite independently of the will of the possessors of wares, a supply of them must daily appear in the market. Whether the sun shines or the rain falls, whether political rumors alarm the exchanges, supply is always equal to the stock of wares. Supply remains equal to the stock of wares, even if the price of wares is unsatisfactory. Whether the price brings the producer gain or loss, the wares must be offered for sale, usually at once. That's supply. Now he's going to talk about demand. Supply can always be measured by the stock of wares in existence. It is exactly equivalent to those wares. Wares command and brook no contradiction. The will of the possessor of wares is so powerless that it may be disregarded. With demand, on the other hand, The will of the possessor of money comes into play. For gold is a patient servant. The possessor of money holds demand like a hound on the leash and lets it slip at the quarry of his choice. Wares are the quarry of demand. Demand enters the market proudly confident of an easy victory. Supply appears dejected like a beggar who expects more kicks than halfpence. On one hand, compulsion. On the other hand, freedom. And the two together, compulsion and freedom, determine price.
I'm sorry, where's the compulsion?
It's the physical decay principle, not just physical decay. It is the fact, as we said, the more general principle of loss of value.
But you're not compelled to be a producer or seller of any specific good or ware, to use his term. So where's the compulsion is voluntarily chosen?
Because to survive in the modern economy of a highly developed division of labor, you don't have the option of picking up a piece of unused land and engaging in self-sufficient production. You have to find a place within the modern economic system to sell your goods or services and thereby acquire all of the other goods and services that you do not produce for yourself, but need in order to survive.
Well, I think compulsion is definitely the wrong word, because that involves someone or some authority compelling you to do a thing. Maybe impulsion would be a better word, that they're motivated by the ongoing obsolescence of their wares to sell them quickly. But I don't see an asymmetry here at all. I mean, you choose what to produce and what to sell. If you don't like the business you're in, then you could just as easily sell your business for gold or money and go on to the other side of the trade, if that's what you so choose.
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Okay, so where we're going next is Gesell is going to make the case that this imbalance between the relative power of sellers of real goods and services vis-a-vis holders of gold money, that is in fact the reason for the existence of interest. That I know that you don't agree with that. Yeah. I know that you probably subscribe to the time preference theory of interest. And
yeah, for sure.
And we can and should have that conversation. But again, for the purpose of describing the Gesellian economic perspective and explaining how this argument holds together, that's where we're going with this. He says that time preference, productivity, abstinence, fructification, all of the competing theories of interest are incorrect, and that interest is in fact a consequence of the creation of an unnatural instrument for to be used as the medium of exchange in our economic system.
Okay. Yeah, definitely is going to be a huge point of divergence there. I have to ask this question, that like, even when you use that word, an unnatural instrument of exchange, what is that based on? I mean, this is one guy's opinion versus the outcome of countless free market actors' actions over time that promoted gold as money. So how do you even hold these two things? How can one guy's opinion say that you're all wrong about money? That all the decisions of all these free market actors across thousands of years that made gold become money, that monetized gold, where is his, what is he standing upon to say that all of humanity is wrong up until this point about money and he's right? Like where is that?
He's standing upon hundreds and thousands of years of human experience of the continued existence and increase of poverty, of wealth inequality.
Well, let's stop with poverty. Poverty definitely has not increased over time. Poverty is the natural state of man. When we're cave people, we're literally all living in poverty, right? Hand to mouth. As you start to accumulate capital over time, consumer goods or capital goods, that is a decrease in poverty. Now, it might not be evenly distributed. There might be certain people that are still in poverty and certain people that are elevating themselves out of poverty. But I don't think it's even within the scope of argument anymore that capitalism has been the system that's pulled more people out of poverty than any other socioeconomic system in history. So where does he say where has poverty increased on an absolute basis?
It's not absolute. You're right that the aggregate production of wealth is much greater.
Yeah.
But the number of people around the world living in poverty is more than used to exist on the whole planet. So,
well, as a proportion of total population, or you're just saying total number of people?
Total number of people.
Well, that's just because the population's gone from 800,000 to 8.5 billion. In the span of 10,000 years or whatever the number is. So if you just say, that's not really an argument. That's just saying that.
Well, his question is the same question as Marx, as I said before. Why, when we have this incredible engine of wealth production, does it not do what the classical economics textbooks say it should do and create a rising tide that lifts all boats?
Well, it does. It creates tools and technologies that were not even available to previous generations. But we have people now, do you know the number one, people are dying of obesity and metabolic disease more so now than they are of starvation. So we've actually produced so much food, not that it's quality food, there's all kinds of issues with that people are no longer dying predominantly of starvation, they're dying predominantly of eating too much bad food. So, how do you reconcile that? There hasn't been an increase in poverty. There's been an increase in the options available to people generally, right? That, refrigeration technology, freezers, all of these things have made food less spoilable over time. So people can preserve it over longer periods of time. And then people are better fed as a result.
Again, we need to pick and choose what we have time to talk about. But I mentioned to you that I live in a pretty different place than where we are right now. I would say that you're describing a pretty first world perspective. I live in Lima, Peru. There are millions of people living in extreme privation a few miles from where I live in very comfortable circumstances. So I would not accept your description as being a universally applicable description of the world as a whole.
Well, sure. Okay. The technology at least is available from the market process that was not available to people previously, right?
Right. But
there's many people, royalty, the richest people in the world, et cetera, that died from very basic diseases just a few generations ago that we now have, $5 Z-Packs that will cure, for instance. So that's kind of the increase in the standard of living that I would attribute to capitalism, free trade, division of labor, whatever, however you want to frame it. The original question was, what place is he standing to say that all of these people are wrong? You said the first was increasing poverty. So I don't see that. I don't see where that is. Increasing poverty. There might still be poverty, but poverty is the natural state. So it's not that we've increased the natural state. We've actually taken many people out of poverty through capitalism, for lack of a better term.
I'm willing to retract increasing poverty and
wealth
replace
inequality
it with
was your second one, I think.
growing wealth inequality.
Yes, which I agree with. And I would attribute mostly to money printing and statism. I don't think capitalism contributes to wealth inequality nearly as much as stealing from the middle class does.
Gesell would say that it is the flow of unearned income. This is going back to the very beginning of our conversation, that there are two primary sources of unearned income. One is land and its improper appropriation into private ownership. And two is a form of money which gives rise to interest, which is a flow of wealth into private pockets, which does not correspond to a contribution of a productive action.
But you can have an interest rate without money. You can have an interest rate in a barter economy. If people are loaning out a capital asset or anything for that matter, right? I'm loaning you my house for a week for apples.
Did you happen to read, I sent Teresa, your agent, the Robinson Crusoe parable that Gesell?
No, but I've read a lot of Robinson Crusoe parables from economists, so I don't know. Which way does he take it?
All right, so Gesell introduces the principle of interest by creating his own variation on the Robinson Crusoe story. And in his variation, Robinson Crusoe is living alone on his island, and he has accumulated capital. And he is at the point of discontinuing his normal economic production of food and clothing and shelter for the purpose of constructing a canal around a mountain that exists on this island, because he lives on one side of the island and the fertile area of the island is on the other side of the island. And constructing this canal, which is a capital improvement project, will greatly improve his economic circumstances. So in order to undertake this, he has calculated that it's going to take him 3 years to dig this canal. And so he has set aside a store of grain that is going to last him for 3 years.
Right.
And he has set aside
This
a
is
store.
the savings underpinning the investment to build the canal.
Yes. And he's set aside a store of buckskins to make clothing that is going to last him for 3 years. And just as he is at the point of embarking on this capital improvement project, another survivor of a shipwreck appears on the island naked and comes up to him and says, I'd like to use some of your accumulated capital. And Crusoe, being a European who is familiar with the principle of interest, says, great, I'm happy to make my capital available to you. I just want to receive interest. So you can take a sack of grain if you agree to repay me a sack of grain plus 10% in a year's time. You can have a chest of buckskins if you agree to repay me 1.1 chests of buckskins in a year's time. And the response of the new arrival is, I'm not going to pay you interest, and I'm going to convince you to lend me your goods without interest, simply by appealing to your self-interest. Look at your stack of grain. If you just leave that sitting there for 3 years, you are going to lose 25% per year to mold, to rot, to insects, to moisture. If you instead give me a loan of your grain without interest, you will get back fresh grain in a year, in 2 years, with no increase, but you will be vastly better off than if you had just left it there to physically degrade. So, and the same applies to the buckskins, that if you just left it sitting there in a chest, it's going to dry out, it's going to rot, it's going to crack. And so the point of this story is that the physical nature of real wealth compels its owner to assent to lending with even without interest, because he will be much better off by being repaid fresh grain in a year's time.
That's still interest, though. If he's actually accounting for the spoilage, in this case, of the grain, you could also call it depreciation is typically associated with a capital asset. Spoilage is associated with a consumable like grain. If he's getting paid back 1-to-1 grain, well, then that expense that he otherwise would have incurred is being made up for by the individual repaying him fresh grain. That's still an inbuilt interest rate, even if it's not 1.1 bushels of grain. If he's just getting back 1-to-1, that's an implied interest rate.
I would disagree. I would say if I give you,
if he know, like it's an accounting thing, right? If I know I've got 3 years worth of grain, but it's going to depreciate by 25% per year, and if he knows that, well, then anything he gets above that is an interest rate.
Let's say that the rate of decay of grain is 25% per year, and let's say I'm not as nice a guy as the stranger who agreed to repay one sack of grain for one sack of grain a year later. Let's say I'm going to use the full extent of my leverage and the laws and the principles of nature to drive the hardest bargain I can possibly drive. You're going to lend me a sack of grain, and I'm going to give you back 85% of a sack of grain in a year's time, and you're still going to be better off than...
Yeah, because I was dumb enough to accumulate 3 years worth of grain that depreciates 25% per year rather than accumulating something that doesn't degrade that way.
But the nature of most real wealth is such that it is not storable without loss.
Hence the beauty of money.
Hence the artificiality of money. Hence the fact that...
I'd be hard-pressed to call that artificial. It emerges in anywhere trade occurs. I don't think there's ever been an economy where there's been trade, or a society where there's been trade, that there hasn't been money. Because money is often defined as the most tradable asset. There
has been thousands of years of society without storable money. There was in Egypt for 1,500 years, the form of money were deposit tickets of grain to the state granaries. And this was before the first coinage. People would harvest grain and they would take it and deposit it in the state granaries, and they would be given receipts. And those receipts had a primitive form of demurrage. And this is the big picture landscape of where Gesell's ideas originally came from. Those tickets did not circulate at par value. They incurred storage and depreciation charges, and they circulated as a medium of exchange for more than 1,000 years.
So why wasn't ancient Egypt the most successful economic story in the history of the human race then, if they already implemented his ideal money?
I'm not familiar enough with the history of Egypt to comment on that. But the point is that there is this story that people tell of gold emerging as money, which I think it's not inarguable that it holds up to historical and archaeological evidence.
That gold emerges as money?
That is a complete telling of the story of the evolution of money.
No, the story's ongoing, right? The story is everything all goods are always competing to be money all the time, right? It's people are trying to figure out, I'm producing this excess, right? I get an economic surplus through my labor. Where do I store that surplus? Right? It's a case by case individual action that people are choosing. And I think over time it coalesces, people's decisions coalesce into one asset being promoted as better money than all the other assets, just like any other tool, right? People will choose a certain type of shovel for digging a certain type of hole because it has certain types of properties. And so it seems to me like gold has been that choice historically, that it's been around for 5,000 years or more as money.
5,000 I wouldn't agree with, but let's set that aside for the moment and let's acknowledge the fact that every country on earth has now chosen to abandon gold as money.
Well, depends how you define money. Central banks still hoard gold. So on a geopolitical basis, gold is still the dominant money. If one country conquers another, they're not going to accept tribute payments in paper. They will accept tribute payments in gold. So on a geopolitical basis between countries, gold is definitely still money. It's been outlawed. Its use has been outlawed for private citizens because fiat currency is a pyramid scheme that nation states can use to extract wealth from their citizens. Alan Greenspan wrote about this way before becoming chairman of the Fed, that private gold ownership had to be outlawed because otherwise it would compete with fiat currency and make fiat currency unusable by the welfare and warfare state. So for fiat currency and central banking paradigm to work, it has to outlaw private gold ownership, which we've seen, right? Executive Order 6102 in 1933, et cetera, et cetera. So I think gold, again, definitions, what is money, at least geopolitical money today, is definitely gold.
Okay, which brings us back to the question, which is the title of your show, what is money? And my definition of money is what you can walk into a store and buy something with. And obviously gold is not that. There's no store.
I don't know. There's a lot of people on earth that accept gold.
What percentage of the stores in South Florida could you walk into with gold?
No, worldwide. I would say gold is more widely accepted worldwide. Ooh, that's probably close with the US dollar. But by the way, the US dollar only gained that level of network effect and broad acceptance because it used to be redeemable for gold. This is the whole scam of fiat currency, is that you make the paper currency redeemable for gold to induce its wide adoption and circulation, and then you rug pull everyone on the redeemability and you leave them with fiat currency.
I get that worldview. I don't subscribe to it because from that point of view, if you say that gold is money, then money has not existed for daily hand-to-hand commerce for how many years, how many decades, anywhere on earth.
No,
Again, show me a store. I'm sure you can show me one store, that is owned by a gold bug who's decided on principle he's going to accept gold for payment. But show me anywhere on earth where 10% of the businesses that comprise a local economy accept gold as a form of payment.
Well, again, prior to 1971, 100% of the businesses that used US dollars accepted gold as payment.
Okay.
It was only by fiat decree that was suspended.
Okay.
And
that's
so,
55 years ago, right?
Yeah.
54.
And that doesn't, it's all definitional. But at the end of the day, you're talking about nation states as tax farms, and nation states have basically manipulated their crops, which are taxpayers, out of having access to real money, which is gold. It's the old bait and switch, right? Oh, look here. This dollar is redeemable for gold, so go use it as if it's as good as gold. people become accustomed to using the paper, and then eventually you 1971 them, rug pull them on the gold, and they keep using the paper out of inertia and ignorance, thinking that that is money and that's the way it's always been. And here we are 55 years later, and most people don't know the difference. Hence the reason for people like me starting a podcast like this, trying to educate them.
I would propose that you allow me to read through a few more important excerpts from Gesell, and that we then just say, this is the end of round one.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right. So what I want to accomplish with this last 10, 15 minutes is to flesh out that argument of Gesell's, which says that interest is a measure of the power imbalance between producers of real goods and services on one side and holders of gold money on the other side. Mm-hmm. Okay? Read some more Gesell for you. Suppose now that demand makes use of the freedom it enjoys and withdraws from the market. Supply must then, because of the compulsion to which it is subject, seek out demand, hasten to meet it, and entice it back to the market by the offer of some special advantage. Demand, instant demand, is a necessity to supply, and demand knows of this necessity. Consequently, demand can usually ask for and obtain some special advantage from its privilege of being able to withdraw from the market. Is there any reason why the possessor of money should not ask for this reward? A and B, separated by space and time, wish to exchange their wares, flour and pig iron, and for this purpose need the money in C's possession. C can at once effect the exchange with his money, or he can delay, hinder, or forbid the exchange. For his money gives him the freedom of choosing the time at which it shall take place. Is it not obvious that C will demand payment for this power, and that A and B must grant it in the form of a tribute on their flour and pig iron? If they refuse this tribute to money, money withdraws from the market. A and B must then retire without completing the sale and undertake the heavy cost of returning home with their unsold products. They will then suffer equally as producers and consumers. As producers, because their wares deteriorate, and as consumers, because they must do without the goods to obtain which they brought their products to market. If, instead of gold, C owned any other product, tea, powder, salt, cattle, or free money, demurrage money, the characteristics of these media of exchange would deprive him of the power of postponing his demand. He would no longer be able to levy a tribute on other products. And that tribute that is demanded by the holder of money, according to Gesell, is interest.
Why wouldn't A and B just use notes of credit? Just buy it on credit and let the credit be the money. Then you can obviate the need for C.
Yes, you're right. Credit, bills of exchange are an alternative. And
so again, money emerges. You don't gain some control. C does not gain some asymmetric control over A and B because he has money. A and B can still.
He doesn't gain complete control.
Doesn't gain any control.
He gains.
He can't prevent them from trading with one another because a bill of credit or a bill of, what did you call it?
Exchange.
Bill of exchange. It's just a promise to pay you in the future, whether in goods or in money or whatever it may be.
Right. But then they've reintroduced the coincidence of wants problem.
Not necessarily. If you accept promises, I mean, that's what fiat currency is basically, right? It's a promise to nothing. And it circulates today as money if we accept money as the universal medium of exchange. If we accept that definition, there's problems with that definition because, another thing money needs to do is be a final extinguisher of debts, which fiat currency can never be because it has debt built into it. So if we just focus on that exchange medium definition, though, then promises can be money. our money, actually. That's, again, what fiat currency is. So that completely excludes C from the equation. A and B can create as many promises as they want between themselves without any input from C.
But they're not fungible. Those promises are not fungible.
Well, they can be.
How?
If they're issued from one bank, or, you put money on deposit with a bank and a bank issues bank notes on top of it.
But then the bank is going to have to get into the business of brokering wheat for chairs.
And it does. That's what commercial credit is.
I'm not aware of any bank that brokers individual commodities for other commodities.
Well, they don't broker it, but they lend against things that are being sold. So that's what commercial credit is, right? If you're like, I need to buy these chairs, but they're in China, the bank will lend you the money to facilitate the purchase. And
right,
then
the
when
money,
they're
the
delivered,
fungible instrument,
well,
which a bill of exchange is not fungible. And that fungibility is the overcoming of the coincidence of wants.
Maybe let's just go straight to the bottom of this philosophically. Is Gesell a Marxist?
No. Gesell's entire introduction is a takedown of Marx. Gesell starts his book by saying Marx was wrong. And here's why.
Well, Marx was wrong about a lot of things, but which things was he wrong about according to Gesell?
Marx was wrong about the cause of surplus value. Are you familiar with the significance?
The labor theory of value?
Surplus value is Marx's term for the increment of wealth that is improperly appropriated by the owner of capital at the expense of the worker.
Yeah, that is definitely wrong because he did not subscribe to marginalism. He thought value was objective, not subjective.
Yes.
Correct? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Which is definitively, provably, definitely wrong.
Yes. And like I just said, and this is why so many people, when they first hear of Gesell, say, that sounds like communism. Mm-hmm. My response is, it is the exact opposite of communism. It is the purest understanding of free market principles, in fact, and the evidence that I present is that he started his book by saying, no, Marx is wrong, and here's why.
Okay.
And let me.
Sorry, how do you convert all of those landowners into non-landowners without invoking socialism or communism or other institutionalized forms of aggression against private property? How is that even possible?
By the issuance of money and the purchasing from them.
But what if I'm a landowner and I say, go fuck yourself? I'm going to keep owning my own land and I'm never selling it to you. How do you convince me to become a non-landowner?
Yes, that requires the power of the state to enforce.
So therefore, it is socialism and or communism. It degenerates into socialism or communism. Socialism being an institutionalized policy of aggression against private property. Communism being the institutionalized policy of the abolition of private property.
I don't agree with those definitions at all, but
that's what they are. That's what statism is. You can't have anything that communism does or anything that socialism does without that institutionalized policy at bottom.
Again, I don't agree with those definitions. And
how would you generate revenue as a socialist or communist state without those things?
They may be concomitants of socialism or communism.
They are the source of all revenues for a socialist or a communist state. There is zero revenue for a socialist or communist state absent the aggression against private property. So if you have no revenue, you have no business, you have no existence. So how could a socialist or a communist regime exist without aggression against private property?
So you're rejecting the more commonly held definition of communism being the
what's Marx's definition of communism? The abolition of private property.
The state ownership of the means of production.
Which is the abolition of private property. Mm-hmm. Individuals own nothing, the state owns everything.
Right.
All power goes to coercion, no power goes to consent.
Right. And Gesell is saying
apply that, but only to the land.
Yes, because
so that's socialism. Right? It's between. Communism's at one extreme. State owns everything. You own nothing. Capitalism's the other extreme. Individuals own everything. State owns nothing. Preferably doesn't exist in anarcho-capitalism. Socialism is the gradient in between. So it sounds like he's smack dab in the middle. State owns all the land. Individuals own all the other stuff.
And I'm arguing that, as we already covered, that by including land as a form of private property that does not fulfill the foundational principle that gives rise to the institution of private property, you are in fact weakening the basis for the institution of private property.
So you would advocate for going out and coercing all of the existing privately held landowners to become non-landowners?
I wouldn't. Gesell would. And
well, how would you do it then if Gesell... Okay, so Gesell would use that, which would definitely make him a socialist, by the way, 100%.
Let's agree to disagree on that point.
Okay. Well, you're aggressing against private property, so I would go with Hoppe's definition of that's what socialism is.
Okay.
If you wouldn't use coercion, you individually would not use coercion to accomplish the conversion of landowners into non-landowners, how would you do it?
I first learned about Gesell 18 years ago. Mm-hmm. I came from a Wall Street background. I believed then, and I believe now, in the principles of free markets. I also believe that Gesell created a narrative that convinced me that what we know as capitalism is a badly implemented instantiation of free market principles, mm-hmm. and that he showed us how to implement it correctly through these two reforms: a different form of money and community, not government. I like the word community, and I'm going to insist on using that word, mm-hmm. ownership of land. I agree that it is inconceivable that those principles could ever make any headway via national governments. Mm-hmm. And I was stuck on that point for quite a long time. I was like, this analysis is sound, but it is practically useless, because mm-hmm. there is no way you could ever implement these principles through the medium of government. Mm-hmm. And I still believe that to be true. Now we're switching from Gesell to Josh. Mm-hmm. My answer to that question was inspired by the Virgil experiment, which I mm-hmm. told you about a little while ago. This little town that tried the money side of the Gesellian solution and experienced extremely positive results. I said to myself, could you create a model that could be deployed at a local community level for the creation of alternative economic zones that people can opt into if they choose? Doesn't require government, would in fact, in a sense, represent a rejection of government, mm-hmm. And would probably inspire the ire of government in exactly the same way that the Virgil experiment did. So my work going forward and promoting these ideas is creating what I have labeled the natural economic system, which is a toolkit for the creation of local community alternative economic zones, which are built on two elements. One is a demurrage currency that cannot be used as a store of wealth, and the second being community ownership of the premises. And this is a work in progress. This is a toolkit that I have not yet fully put together, that I want to make available to anyone who thinks this argument makes sense.
Okay. Fair enough. And on that note, thank you for the conversation. Yeah, I don't think there's been much movement on either side, but fun nonetheless to go and hash out the differences. Where can people find out more about you online or find out more about your work online?
I've got a website, silviogesell.com. I taught a course recently through the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City, which is available on our YouTube channel, the Silvio Gesell Foundation YouTube channel. And I am also the host of a recently initiated podcast called Economy 2.0, which I produce in conjunction with the Henry George School, which is essentially an examination of alternative visions for models that could replace the failing conventional economy.
Beautiful. Josh, thank you so much.
Been a pleasure. Hope to do it again.
We'll do it again.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.